The night my granddaughter called me from the emergency room, I was sitting in my recliner with the television on and a cup of cold coffee on the side table. I wasn't really watching anything, just the blue light flickering across the ceiling, the way it does when you're too tired to sleep but too old to pretend otherwise. My phone buzzed. The screen said Haley, and I picked it up on the first ring, the way I always do when it's her. What I heard on the other end wasn't a hello. It was breathing, fast, ragged, then a sob she was trying to swallow. "Grandpa," her voice was barely a whisper. "Grandpa, I need you to come. I'm at Mercy General. But please don't tell Mom you're coming, please." I was already standing up. I've spent 31 years working fraud investigations for the county DA's office in Clarksburg, West Virginia. I've sat across the table from men who looked me in the eye and lied without blinking. I know the difference between a teenager being dramatic and a child who is genuinely afraid. My granddaughter wasn't being dramatic. "I'm on my way," I said. "You stay on the line with me until I get there." She cried quietly, the whole 17 minutes it took me to drive. When I walked into the ER waiting room, she was sitting in the corner chair closest to the nurse's station. Her left arm was wrapped in a temporary splint. Her right eye was swollen nearly shut, the skin around it already turning the deep purple green of a bruise that had been building for hours. I crossed the room faster than a 64-year-old man with a bad hip should be able to move. She stood up and I put my arms around her, and she started shaking the way people do when they've been holding themselves together for too long. And someone safe finally shows up. "It's all right," I kept saying. "I've got you. I've got you." A nurse appeared beside us. Young woman, serious face, the kind of eyes that had seen too much of this. "Sir, are you family?" "Her grandfather," I said. She nodded slowly. "The doctor will want to speak with you. There are some things we're required to note in the chart." I looked at Haley. She was 15 years old, and she looked like she was about 6. "Can you tell me what happened?" I asked her quietly. Once the nurse stepped away to page someone. She wouldn't look at me at first. She kept her eyes on the floor and she said, "I fell down the stairs." I took a slow breath. "Haley, look at me." She did. And that's when I saw it, not just the fear, but the specific kind of fear that comes from being told, over and over again, that no one will believe you. "I need to know the truth," I said. "I'm not going to be angry with you, but I need to know what actually happened." She was quiet for a long moment, then she said, "He pushed me." I kept my face very still. "Your stepfather?" She nodded. "Has this happened before?" She looked at the floor again. That was enough of an answer. The doctor came in about 10 minutes later. His name was Dr. Ashworth, a calm man in his mid-50s who spoke the way good doctors do, clearly, carefully, like every word mattered. He said the wrist was fractured, a clean break at the radius, consistent with catching yourself in a fall or, and he said this carefully, watching my face, consistent with a defensive injury, the kind a person sustains when they're trying to shield themselves from impact. The bruising around the orbital area, he said, is consistent with a direct blunt force impact, not a fall against a stair edge. The distribution is wrong for that. "Meaning?" I said. "Meaning she was struck. Something flat. A hand, possibly." I sat in that plastic chair beside my granddaughter's hospital bed and I felt a cold settle into me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It wasn't rage, exactly. It was something older than rage. Something that had been building in me for a year and a half without a name. Haley's mother, my daughter, Renata, had married this man named Clifford Bain about 18 months ago. She'd met him through a colleague at work, one of those introductions that seems accidental, but in retrospect you wonder about. He was 47, divorced, worked in real estate development. He dressed well. He spoke well. He had the easy confidence of a man who had never once been told no in a way that stuck. From the beginning, something in me didn't sit right with him. He was too smooth. Not in an obvious way, not slick like a used car salesman. More like a man who had practiced being charming so long he'd forgotten it was a performance. He shook my hand firmly every time he saw me and called me sir and asked thoughtful questions about my work, and I smiled and answered and thought, privately, that I had interviewed enough liars in my career to recognize the texture of one. But my daughter was happy. Or she seemed happy, and after everything she'd been through, losing her husband to a stroke when Haley was only 9, I told myself I was being protective, suspicious. An old man who couldn't let his daughter find her own way. I was wrong to tell myself that. The doctor stepped out to fill out some paperwork. Haley and I sat alone in the curtained bay, the sounds of the ER drifting around us, rolling carts, someone calling out a room number, the low beeping of monitors. "Where is your mother right now?" I asked. "At home." Haley hesitated. She doesn't know I called 911. Clifford told her I called because I was embarrassed, that I wanted attention. "And what did your mother say?" Haley's voice went very small. She said I needed to stop trying to ruin things for her. Something broke open in my chest a little when she said that. Not because I thought my daughter was a bad person. She wasn't. She was a woman who had been alone for 6 years, and who had let her relief at not being alone anymore cloud everything else. I understood it. That didn't make it less dangerous. "Haley," I said, "I need you to trust me right now. Can you do that?" She looked at me with that swollen eye and she nodded. "I'm going to handle this, but I need you to tell the doctor the truth, the whole truth, what you told me. Can you do that?" She thought about it. She was 15, so she thought about it the way 15-year-olds do, weighing every consequence, every way it could go wrong, every version of the future where speaking up made things worse. Finally, she nodded again. Dr. Ashworth came back. A woman from the hospital social work team came with him. I stepped just outside the curtain and let them speak with Haley alone, the way the protocol requires. Through the curtain I could hear her voice, thin and careful at first, then steadier. I stood in the hallway and I called my daughter. She picked up on the third ring. "Dad?" She sounded surprised, a little annoyed. "It's almost 11. I'm at Mercy General," I said. "With Haley." Silence. "What? Why didn't anyone?" Her voice shifted, got that particular mother pitch. "Is she okay? What happened?" "She has a fractured wrist and a black eye," I said. I kept my voice even, steady. 31 years of sitting across tables from people I was angry at. It's useful training. The doctor says the injuries are not consistent with a fall. Another silence. Longer. "Clifford," said she. "I know what Clifford said," I told her. "I'm asking you to come to the hospital. Not to call Clifford first. Not to tell him where you're going. Just come, and we'll talk." She came. When she walked into the ER, she looked like a woman who had already had an argument with herself in the car and hadn't won. Her face was tight, her eyes red-rimmed. She was dressed in clothes she'd pulled on quickly. Sweater inside out, which she didn't notice until Haley pointed it out later, quietly, with the ghost of a teenage eye roll that was so normal it almost made me laugh. Almost. The three of us sat together while Dr. Ashworth went through his findings again, and I watched my daughter's face as he explained the nature of the injuries. I watched the moment when her professional understanding overrode her personal one. She'd worked in hospital administration for 12 years. She knew what defensive fractures were. She didn't say anything for a long time after he finished. She just sat there holding Haley's good hand. Then she said, "Baby, I'm so sorry." Haley leaned against her. They stayed like that. I stepped into the hallway again. I had some calls to make. The first call was to a colleague of mine, a woman named Darlene Oates, who had been a sheriff's deputy in Harrison County for over 2 decades. We'd worked together on 3 separate cases, involving financial fraud with a domestic violence component, the kind of thing where abusive men also happened to be stealing from their families. Darlene had a particular hatred for that specific overlap. "Dex," she said when she picked up, because she's called me Dex since 1997, something that started as a joke about my habit of using index cards and never quite stopped. "Why are you calling me at 11 on a Tuesday?" I explained what I had. There was a short silence, then the sound of her sitting up. "The doctor documented it?" "In the chart. The social worker took a formal statement from my granddaughter about 20 minutes ago. And where is the husband right now?" "Home. Best I know." "You haven't called him?" "No." "Good," she said. "Stay exactly where you are. Don't go to that house tonight." "I mean it, Dex. You stay in that hospital until I call you back." I knew she was right. I also knew that staying put was going to be the hardest thing I did that night. It was. I sat in that hallway for 2 hours and 14 minutes. I drank bad vending machine coffee, and I thought about every conversation I'd had with Clifford Bain in 18 months. I thought about the way he talked about Haley, always a little sideways, always a slight edge, underneath the words that you could chalk up to the difficulty of a step-parent relationship if you wanted to. I thought about how he'd steered my daughter away from a dinner with me and Haley at Thanksgiving, because Haley had an attitude problem this week, and we're working on it. I thought about how Haley had barely spoken at Christmas. I thought about how I'd let myself believe what I wanted to believe because it was easier, and because I loved my daughter, and didn't want to be the reason she lost something else. Darlene called back at 12:48 in the morning. "I've got a deputy heading to your daughter's residence now," she said. "They'll take a statement from Bain. In the meantime, I need you to do something for me. Name it. Think back. Has anything about this man's financial behavior ever struck you as off? Specifically in relation to your daughter's assets." I paused. "What have you got?" "Maybe nothing. Maybe something." A name came up in a case we've had open for 6 months, connected to a property development scam out of Morgantown. "I'm not saying it's the same man, but I'd like to know if your son-in-law ever talked to you about his business dealings." I thought about it carefully, and I started talking. The next 3 weeks were the most methodical of my life, and I have spent a career being methodical. I called in favors. I went through every document I could legally access. I sat down with Darlene twice more, once with an assistant DA I'd worked with for years. My daughter, once the shock settled, started going through her own records, their joint accounts, a property she'd co-signed without fully understanding what she was signing, a life insurance policy amendment she didn't remember agreeing to. What we found was not small. Clifford Bain, whose name I discovered was filed under 2 slightly different spellings in public records, a thing that is either sloppiness or deliberate, and in my experience it is rarely sloppiness, had done this before. A previous wife in Fairmont, a business partner in Morgantown who'd settled a civil suit quietly enough that it barely left a trace, a pattern of entering relationships with women who had children, who had assets, who had established lives that could be slowly, quietly reorganized around him. He was careful, careful enough that nothing had ever risen to the level of criminal prosecution. Careful enough that he'd always had a story, always had someone to speak well of him, always had just enough paper between himself and the thing he'd actually done, but not careful enough. The property my daughter had co-signed was supposed to be a joint investment. Her equity from the sale of her first house rolled into a development he was managing. On paper, it looked legitimate. In practice, the LLC he'd set up to manage it had a structure that routed money through a shell company registered in Delaware. The beneficial owner of that shell company was a name I didn't recognize. It took my friend at the state tax office 3 days to trace it back. It traced back to Clifford. He'd been siphoning her investment into his own pocket in increments small enough not to trigger automatic review. He'd been doing it for 14 months. On a Thursday afternoon, I sat across a table from the assistant DA, and I put a folder of documents in front of her. She went through them page by page, not saying anything, just reading. "This is real," she said. "Yes," I said. "How long did this take you?" 3 weeks. I paused, and 18 months of ignoring something I shouldn't have ignored. She nodded. She didn't say anything reassuring. I appreciated that. Clifford Bain was arrested on a Friday, which I know sounds like the kind of detail that only matters to the person who spent a month working toward it. He was charged with 1 count of felony domestic battery, Haley's testimony, the medical documentation, and the statement of a neighbor who turned out to have heard things through the shared wall of my daughter's townhouse on at least 4 prior occasions. He was also charged with 2 counts of financial fraud and 1 count of wire fraud related to the shell company scheme. I found out about the arrest the way I'd asked Darlene to arrange it. A text message, 2 words. "It's done." I was in my daughter's kitchen when I got it. She was at the table, Haley across from her, the 2 of them working on a puzzle they'd started earlier in the week. One of those enormous ones, 1,000 pieces, a picture of the Appalachian Mountains in autumn. They'd been working on it in small sessions, a half hour here, 20 minutes there, the way people do when they need something quiet to do with their hands, while they figure out how to talk about things that are hard. I put my phone down on the counter. "It's done," I said. My daughter looked up, her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She'd done a lot of crying in the past 3 weeks, and she'd told me, one night over the phone, that she felt like she was running out of it. Like there was a finite supply and she'd used most of it up, and now what was left was something else. Something more like determination. Haley looked between us. "What does that mean?" "It means he was arrested," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked back down at the puzzle. She found a piece she'd been looking for, one of the orange-red ones from the upper corner, the maples, and she set it into place. Okay, she said. Not relief, exactly. 15-year-olds who've been living with something like that for a long time don't feel instant relief when it stops. It takes a while. The body doesn't believe it's over until over and over and over it happens to be true. But she kept putting pieces together. At the bail hearing 2 weeks later, the judge denied bail on the fraud charges pending asset review. The domestic battery charge carried a mandatory protective order. Clifford Bain could not contact my daughter or my granddaughter. He could not come within 500 feet of either of them. His attorney, a man who looked exactly like you'd expect the attorney of a Clifford Bain to look, argued that the fraud charges were being used to overcomplicate what was a domestic matter. The assistant DA, who is a woman I have a great deal of respect for, replied with a calmness that I recognized as the kind that comes from knowing you have everything you need. She was right. She had everything she needed. I sat in the back row of that courtroom and I watched and I felt, for the first time in a long time, like things were going to be all right. Not easy, not simple, not without the long work of undoing what had been done. The therapy Haley was starting, the legal process of untangling my daughter's finances, the slower process of her learning to trust her own judgment again. But all right. People ask me sometimes, friends, former colleagues who heard about it through the professional grapevine, they ask me how I knew. How I knew something was wrong with him from the beginning before anything happened. I don't have a clean answer. I have 31 years of watching people. And the thing that watching people teaches you is not how to read minds. It's how to pay attention to the small things you keep noticing and then explaining away. The way he corrected Haley at the dinner table and then looked at my daughter to see if she'd noticed him correcting Haley. The way he answered questions about his past with just enough detail that it sounded like an answer without actually being one. The way he made my daughter feel, in small ways I couldn't quite point to, like she was lucky he'd chosen her. I noticed those things. I told myself I was being unfair. I should have listened to myself earlier. The thing I tell people, if they're asking because they have someone in their life like Clifford Bain, someone they keep noticing things about and then explaining away, the thing I tell them is this. The feeling that something is wrong is almost never wrong. It's the part after that's hard. The part where you decide what to do about it, where you risk being wrong, where you risk your relationship with the people you're trying to protect. It's hard. It's worth it. I am 64 years old. I spent 31 years in public service, and I have 3 grandchildren, and I coach a little league team on Saturday mornings, which is a thing I started doing after I retired, because I needed something that wasn't paperwork. And on the Saturday morning after the bail hearing, I drove to the field at 8:45, and I set up the bases, and I watched 8-year-olds throw a ball around in the May sunshine, and I thought about Haley in the ER with her inside-out sweater and her fractured wrist, and I thought about her at the kitchen table, setting a puzzle piece into place and saying, okay, and I thought that of all the things I'd done in 31 years, none of it mattered more than the 17 minutes I drove in the dark when my phone rang. You pick up, you show up, you stay. That's the whole thing, really. That's all of it.